Resuming debate, the honourable member for Windsor West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I will be splitting my time with the member for Drummond, and I want to touch on a couple of things. I'm going to focus some of my remarks on some of the consumer pricing issues that we have with regards to gasoline and fuel that hasn't been touched enough on this debate because there are things that we can do outside of building pipelines and infrastructure issues related to that actually could bring greater consumer accountability because there is a rip-off at the pumps taking place and there is not enough accountability. I'm going to lay out three of those different things. A couple of things I do want to talk, though, in terms of concluding some remarks, though, about the previous discussion that we had with the Philippines and the fact that it's a so-called good news story from the parliamentary secretary that a nation where we have a strong historic relationship with us actually had to threaten to go to war with us because over 100 contaminated filled containers of human waste and other trash was sent to their shores and stayed there, and his Minister of Environment in the Philippines promised to take care of it, never did anything like another broken Liberal promise, but instead they decided finally to act on it. And ironically, just as an update, Mr. Speaker, there's 69 containers left. Canada said they'll finally take them back, so apparently that's good news, is that we're actually going to take it back, and there's a complication because some of them are contested with termites. So that's apparently a good news story by the Minister of the Parliamentary Secretary of the Prime Minister. I'm not surprised because they have very few environmental victories that are so-called reality. One of them I asked about today in question period, never got a response to, and that's Ojibwe Shores, where we have over 100 endangered species, and we have this government yet to act to protect that area after the community fought to save it from being bulldozed to the ground. And it takes a simple transfer of that land to the Minister of Environment, who she will not answer or do anything onto it to this day. Real action, real simple process that could take place to create a national park, but more importantly, protect over 100 endangered species on the Great Lakes. They refuse to do that. A transferable paper of one department to the next, and refuse to do that. And it's unacceptable, Mr. Speaker. I'll also touch on real briefly the issue the parliamentary secretary just raised with regards to the incentive for the auto electric vehicles that they put in place. First and foremost, Mr. Speaker, my riding of Windsor West, which had been producing the minivan for generations, was left off the original list. Yeah. So the only Canadian-built electric vehicle was left off the Liberal list, putting everybody towards away from domestic manufacturing, despite the company and the workers, most importantly, Mr. Speaker, providing taxpayer money through taxes day in, day out, and making sure that they produce world-class products that have been award-winning, were left off by this government. Second to that, they won't even respond to the fact that their incentive program is not even matching the one that was just killed in Ontario. The Minister of Innovation came to Windsor basically saying, oh, no, we're going to put it on the list, we're going to put it on the list, it's going to be on the list, don't worry about it. And then he criticizes Doug Ford, just like this parliamentary secretary did, for killing the Ontario program. But you know what? Doug Ford's program was $10,000 for those vehicles, actually up to $14,000. Parliamentary secretary should know that his government won't even match that. So he comes to Windsor, and the fact that it's the only electric vehicle and it's multi-passenger will get more vehicles off the road than other things that are smaller is not going to get an incentive based upon that. It's going to basically get the $5,000 after we had to actually bring them kicking and screaming to fix it. Ironically, this was a plant that the Prime Minister toured less than a year ago. So my advice is, if you have an auto plant, don't have the Prime Minister tour it, because obviously it doesn't do any good, because he's on the assembly line one time making a photo op, and then second to that, later on, he's saying to the workers there, oh, we have $300 million for incentive vehicles for low emissions and for electric vehicles, but by the way, we don't want domestic ones. We don't want the ones from Canadian auto workers. We want them from overseas, from Mexico, from China, from the United States. So, Mr. Speaker, those things that they are doing right now are unacceptable because they're actually practical, real things that could help And that actually, too, Mr. Speaker, is an important point of what we can discuss today, is how we want to reduce dependency upon the oil and gas sector. And this incentive program that the government's put in place is not sufficient for that. Ironically, they want to get up and criticize others, but they won't even meet the makers of the criticisms to the table and actually lead by example, and it's unacceptable. A couple of things that are interesting with regards to this motion, and one of the reasons that I can't support it is that's nothing for consumer accountability. The motion simply reads that the House call on the government to stop raising the price of gas by clearing the way for pipelines and eliminating the carbon tax on fuel. It does nothing, Mr. Speaker, to reverse some of the attempts that have been in this House over the past decades to actually bring some consumer accountability to the price at the pump, and also consumer accountability about the knowledge of the product that you're buying at the pump, and more importantly, Mr. Speaker, gouging that can take place. And Mr. Speaker, there have been several attempts that have taken place in this chamber. I first learned when I came here back in 2002, some of the good work of then Dan McTagg, as a Liberal member, did a lot of work on industry committee. We actually had hearings, and we've had several proposals, including actually the Paul Martin administration, that was to bring in some changes for consumer accountability and tracking. They did promise that, and they never delivered. It's another broken promise. And I want to highlight a couple of ones, Mr. Speaker, that are important because they're out there that are still happening today that are not resolved. So as we're talking about the debate and we're stuck with this kind of, I guess, future-driven process of evaluating pipelines and trying to see if that's somehow going to affect the price of gasoline or not, but we can do some of those things right today by actually bringing greater accountability to the pump. The first one that took place that was in the most recent, I guess, backtracking for consumers was a Conservative bill, C-14. It was an act to amend the Electricity and Gas Inspection Act and the Weights and Measures Act. Now, Mr. Speaker, there was a question by the late Jack Layton, who looked into this, and I would give credit to them at that time, to the late Minister of Jim Prentice, aside that I'm talking about two individuals who have passed this place and also have passed our country. But what they did do in this exchange is it came to basically light that Canadians are overcharged at the pump, and they are doing so in the tens of millions of dollars. In fact, at one point, there was actually, from 1999, when they looked at some of those things, back up to a decade later, was basically $240 million of so-called phantom gas. This is gas that you pay for at the pump, and it's not measured by the flow meter correctly, or the flow control valve doesn't work, and so you get charged for that. Now, on any given time, Mr. Speaker, with regards to you at the pump, there is an average of 4% of these pumps do not work properly at any given time. And then there's a whole series of them. Those are the ones that are ruled out in terms of when they do the inspections and they do the analysis. They are normally not working around 4% of them at that time. Now, if you include the 14 days that they're allowed to fix it, they have to fix it if they're in 0.5% to 1.5% off with regards to those charges, Mr. Speaker. They have to fix it within 14 days. Now, this can add up. Now, the sad thing, Mr. Speaker, is that the Conservatives privatized those inspections of this, and we have less inspections. And there's also a question with regards to, they usually get around maybe every 2 years, and so we have less control about that. So I would say, Mr. Speaker, if we wanted to rebate consumers quicker, bring greater accountability and confidence in the price of what you're paying for, is to increase those inspections to once a year. Now, another issue that we can do, Mr. Speaker, is we can create an oil and gas ombudsman office. That has been something that was recommended with regards to our committee in Parliament going back, Mr. Speaker, to 2002. And it was subsequently, as I mentioned, one of the things that the Paul Martin administration was supposed to bring in, had promised to do so and did not. Now, what this would do, it would investigate complaints independently. It would also have the ability to gather information. And one of the key elements that we're missing with regards to Canada versus the United States and accountability is that the U.S. has the Department of Energy's weekly petroleum status report, thus giving weekly updates on refining oil and petroleum production. That alone, Mr. Speaker, would create more transparency and accountability so you would know and be able to track your gasoline to the pump at that time and know if there is being some gouging taking place, and the office would have some teeth to be able to investigate that properly. Now, they would also produce, maintain data and make sure that big oil companies allow the Ombudsman's office to actually provide objective answers free from the industry and of bias, so we could create a little bit more sense of confidence for them. The second thing that we can do, Mr. Speaker, our third thing, is a petroleum monitoring agency. And when we looked at the price spikes with regards to Katrina and other types of natural disasters and some human disasters, and then trade issues, and then we have a number of different production problems, we could, Mr. Speaker, have some greater impact there. So in conclusion, Mr. Speaker, there's more than just about what's in the big future with regards to these things. There's also things that we can enact right now to ensure consumer accountability and more money in your pocket right now.
Question.